Welcome, everybody, to the 51st episode of the JewishDrinking.com podcast and video show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm excited to welcome back to the show Professor Joshua Kulp. We discussed in this episode using various beverages for Havdallah and Kiddush, various beverages that are not wine. So previously, Professor Kulp appeared on the How Whiskey Became the Catalyst for Selling of Chametz episode, and this one we're actually, yes, whiskey will come up, but really focusing on beer. That's right. And if you want a fuller background experience, you can also check out, although no obligation to, you can also check out the episode featuring Professor Jordan Rosenblum on how beer became acceptable for Havdallah in the Babylonian Talmud. So without further ado, here we go.
Joshua Kulp, who is the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of the conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, correct?
Correct. How you
Awesome.
doing?
All right.
Good to be here again. We're
Yes,
all
awesome.
set.
And as anybody can tell from looking at Dr. Kulp's shirt, he's also a craft beer fan.
I'm wearing my craft beer shirt from Creature Comforts, now a brewery down about an hour north of Atlanta. I was there a couple years ago. Great atmosphere, great vibe. If you're anywhere near Atlanta, highly recommend going to the place when it's safe to do so.
Yes. And that is the perfect segue into the topic today, beer, because beer is really the inspiration for our episode of discussing non-wine options for Havdallah, which originally pops up through a story in the Babylonian Talmud, which for those who remember, there was an earlier episode with Professor Jordan Rosenblum where we discussed just the Talmudic context of that story and how that plays out within the Talmud. This episode with Dr. Kulp, however, expands into the medieval era and conversations around what other possibilities, what are the parameters beyond just what is on the Talmud page.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to be back here. I think we should remind the listener a little bit about what the story is in the Talmud, because there's a key phrase there that really is puzzling, and like most puzzling phrases, leads to all sorts of indecision or disputes in subsequent halacha. So the story is about a Maimar. He's in Babylonia, and he goes and visits a couple friends for Shabbos. And after Shabbos is over, they give him beer for Havdallah. And a Maimar is surprised, which is also interesting. Remember, the whole story takes place in Babylonia. A Maimar is surprised that he's getting beer for Havdallah. He's obviously used to wine, and he's very careful about it. He won't drink the beer. He won't. And there's a halacha that you don't eat on Motzei Shabbat until you've had Havdallah. So a Maimar basically goes the whole night fasting. His gracious hosts strenuously look for beer. They exert themselves, the Talmud says, to look for wine for him, and they find him wine, which is also an important fact, that there is wine in Babylonia. It's just not what these hosts were used to using for Havdallah. It seems a bit harder to find than beer.
Although it's important to note they didn't just go in their back, coat room and find some wine. It wasn't immediately. It was the next day.
Correct. Very good. They had to wait for the next day. Assumedly, they went to the marketplace the next day, and maybe there was some obscure marketplace. It sounds like it's like wine's available, but it's not something they're used to drinking. There are a whole bunch of interesting consequences for the story. For instance, one wonders, what did they do Kiddush the night before over? But I'm not going to get into Kiddush. When it comes to Kiddush on Friday night, the halachot tended to be much more stringent. It's the most important opportunity, and the halachot tended to be much more stringent that we have to drink wine. But there are other, involving Shabbat, there are other alcohol drinking opportunities, if you will. There's Kiddush during the day, and there's Havdallah at night, which always seem to be a little bit secondary. So the conversation really focuses more on both Kiddush during the day and Havdallah. But we'll focus for now on Havdallah.
Although I will point out that the Talmud itself struggles to deal literally going backwards in generations throughout the pericope, the sugi, and the Talmud of could you use different types of beer, fig beer, wheat beer, all these different types of beers, and it's really unclear, and they have to reach back. And there still is even Tanaitic evidence that beer is potentially a possibility for even Friday night Kiddush.
Yeah, to go back into the sugya, correct. There are people in the sugya itself who say that you could use beer, and when they're talking about Kiddush, assumingly they're talking about Friday night Kiddush.
Right.
But it's a little bit more of a thorny problem, and I just don't want the listener to get the impression that there's any post-Talmudic authorities who think that you can do Friday night Kiddush over beer. As far as I know, there are not. And that the halacha is on Friday night you have to use wine. And actually, interestingly, if you don't have wine, you're supposed to use the bread. So I don't want to do Kiddush over bread. I don't want to go into that.
The reason I bring it up is not for confusion, but because the conversation in the Talmud centers around the similarity of use of beverage for Kiddush as it is for Havdalah. That basically, just as we don't do Kiddush on something, we shouldn't do Havdalah on something, and vice versa. That we should do, Havdalah and Kiddush on X, Y, or Z.
Correct. So let's get back to the story of a Maimar. A Maimar comes back again the following year, and puzzlingly doesn't seem to remember what had happened the previous year, which I always find like, what happened? Maybe he drank too much for Havdalah, doesn't remember what happened. So he comes back to the following year, and they serve him beer again, and now he remembers. And now he says, oh, you know what? It must be that in this place, it's what's called Chemar Medina, the wine of the region, of the province. And that phrase is a very important phrase because it shows you that there are beverages that replace wine, and that Havdalah and assumedly Kiddush as well, and other opportunities to sanctify a religious association with a glass of something. You need something that is the wine of the region. And I'm interested in really what does that mean to be the wine of the region. And to be the wine of the region also means that you have to define what is wine. I mean, we all know what wine is. It's alcohol derived from grapes, generally speaking. But there's something a little bit more. If you can be the wine of the region without having the same ingredients as wine, that means that wine is more than just based on its ingredients. You can be the wine of something, of a certain place, and yet have some other different ingredients. So this is the question that becomes the major question for post-Talmudic authorities. Can you, should you, is it allowed? What are the circumstances in which you can use something besides the traditional wine, specifically for Havdalah and for Kiddush during the day? We'll leave aside Kiddush afterwards. And there are fascinating discussions among the Rishonim and Achronim, post-Shulchan Aruch authorities, about what does it mean to be the wine of the region. And I think it helps clarify the role that alcohol takes in our lives. So just a couple definitions, a couple questions. Clearly, as I said before, there is wine in the place where a Maimar is visiting. There is wine. It's just hard to get, and people don't drink it. It's not there. And throughout history, we like to associate some places are beer drinking places and some places are wine drinking places. I know you went in this with Jordan. Israel, Palestine was much more of a wine associated place, and Babylonia was beer associated place. But there was wine in Babylonia, and there was beer in the land of Israel. As far as I know, in the Middle East and in Europe, there weren't places that didn't have various types of alcoholic beverages. Most places had wine and had other alcohol, but the question is, what was more prevalent? What was more normal to drink? In our mind, we would associate, for instance, France, Italy, or Spain to a certain extent are wine drinking countries, and England, Germany, Amsterdam, I would argue like the northeast of the United States are beer drinking areas. Maybe if you went to California, it would be a wine drinking area, although there's plenty of good beer there now. But Northern California is a place that grows wine. So the Rishonim ask, like, how hard does it have to be to get wine for you to be able to use something else? How expensive does it have to be? If wine is really expensive, can you use beer? So that's an interesting question. What about somebody who prefers beer? They're both available. Wine is available, but you happen to like beer more than wine. I think that as much as I love beer, it seems like in the ancient world, beer, it was just usually not as good. Maybe it wasn't as filtered. It wasn't, it was just like a mucky kind of mess. I think that for the most part, we find most people preferring wine over beer. But in the Middle Ages, I'm not so sure that's true anymore.
So yeah. I don't know about more broadly speaking, but even in the Talmud, Rav Papa likes beer better than wine. So it's not altogether clear. And also we do see in that sugi in Pesachim where Levi sends this like really nice date beer to Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, and even there, like it gives him pause. He says, "Wait, maybe you could sing all the praises and say Kiddush on this. It's super nice. It's actually risen to the level of wine, except he just has internal digestion issues with it later."
Famously, internal digestion issues. Poor guy's been remembered 2,000 years later. Remember his bad stomach.
It's a bad drinking incident.
Yeah, I don't know. Rav Papa is known for making beer. He's known for drinking beer. Well, we'll look it up afterwards whether he actually says that beer is better than wine. And even that whole sugya seems like, let's put it this way: there's no one who says that wine can't be used for any of these ritual purposes. Everybody holds a wine is fine. The question is beer also fine? Even that piece about this really good beer, it equals wine, means the wine to a certain extent is the standard of quality. And maybe you can get beer that comes close to wine, but not quite. Now, certainly in our days, there's plenty of people, myself included, I would 10 times rather have a glass of beer than wine. And even when people serve me expensive, really good wine, it reminds me a little bit of soccer. I didn't grow up as a soccer fan, but every time I watch a soccer game, I'm bored. And it's not that I don't like wine, but I would much prefer to watch American football than soccer, and I would way prefer a good beer than a really good wine. I mean, you can give me a fine, average, really good double IPA. I'll take it any day over your most expensive bottle of wine. So Rav Hai Gaon says, Gaon in the 10th century, says if you prefer beer, then you can use beer, which is an important step. That if it's a personal preference, it doesn't matter that it might not be what everybody else is drinking around in town. But if you prefer beer, you can drink beer. But not everybody agrees with that. There are people who think that wine is absolutely, I would say, like ontologically better. It's just better than beer. It doesn't matter what you like, what you like. You have this sometimes in the Talmud that halacha is not determined what you want. Halacha is determined what's normally preferred. And I am interested, when I tell people that I prefer beer over wine, they'll usually tell me I haven't drank the right wine, there's something wrong with me. You go into a liquor store, now it's changing a little bit, but I'm amazed at how many bottles of wine I see at liquor stores. Just aisles and aisles of different bottles of wine.
But you know what? Amazing. Wine drinkers will probably think the same thing about beer. Why is there so many beers out there?
Sure they will. And I classify the world. I have friends who are wine drinkers, but I really think that the world can be classified into wine and beer drinkers. Now there are, like for instance, the Ramah, the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch says that even if the wine is bad, it's better than beer. Okay, he does though make the interesting, one of my favorite comments. He says there's a custom at the end of Pesach to do Havdallah on beer. Yeah. You can imagine why. I'm kind of a little sick of it. That's a great Havdallah opportunity.
Well, Ramah right there says because it's beloved to you. Like you've missed it for over a week. The heart grows fonder, right?
Right. But the assumption is that you're not normally doing Havdallah over beer. It's just that special occasion. Now, interestingly, in the post-Shulchan Aruch era, we start to find many rabbis doing Kiddush during the day over hard alcohol. Hard alcohol didn't exist. We talked about that the other time. Hard alcohol really didn't exist. And if it had existed, it wasn't available to most people. But by the 16th, 17th, certainly 18th century, it's very common for rabbis to be doing Kiddush during the day and Havdallah over hard alcohol. It seems to have been much more widely available, as we learned last time, much more widely available in Poland. It probably was a lot cheaper. Most of the Ashkenazi Jews lived in cold countries. I'm sure it was expensive to get wine, and you find many of them doing Havdallah over hard alcohol or Kiddush during the day. Not a Kiddush at night, but Kiddush during the day over hard alcohol. And we see this debate continuing into the modern period. The most interesting thing, and really this is sort of the one I like to reflect on the most, is Rav Moshe Feinstein's opinion, who is the most authoritative rabbi, I would say, in modern American history. Go ahead.
Before we get to the 20th century, I want to, could it be that this entire discussion is really a diasporic conversation? Because if wine, which is the beverage of Israel, wine is always going to be preferred in Israel, then the rest of the world, it's really, the whole story really pops up in the diaspora. It pops up in Persia, right? With the Maimar story. And all the Rishonim here are discussing in this land and that land. They're all not Eretz Israel. They're not the land of Israel.
Yeah, but there are Rishonim who live in wine-producing countries, and there are Rishonim who live in beer-dominated countries. So Rishonim who lived in Germany, for instance, the Tosfot, were actively involved in the wine trade and drank copious amounts of wine. For them, wine would have clearly dominated. There's no doubt in my mind that wine dominated the landscape in Germany and in France in the real formative period. Also for the Rambam in Spain, wine would have dominated beer. We don't find so many discussions there about beer in Spanish Rishonim either. And also Christian countries are often, at least only Catholic countries, have often been associated with wine production. So yeah, it's a diaspora discussion because there really aren't many Jews outside of the land of Israel. There are not many Jews in the land of Israel, or at least not authoritative Jews for many thousands of years. Right. But there are places where it's the main beverage.
Do the contours of the conversation differ for the Rishonim in the more wine-producing countries versus those in the less availability of wine, let's say?
My sense is that yes. My sense is that among the Tosfot, there would be a clear preference for wine. Also, let's face it, the Gemara's discussion is wine allowed? The Gemara's discussion is beer allowed? And in any cut, there's clearly a preference. Like if you want to make sure, and if you're conservative in your tendencies and you want to make sure that you fulfill the halacha correctly, you're always safe with wine. The Rambam, for instance, it is better to use bad. And bad wine would have been, Chick points this out in his book, that wine would have gone bad really quickly in the Middle Ages. The technology they had for holding on to.
By the way, I will say there's also a conversation about even using raisins to make sort of like raisin wine, because at least raisins come from grapes, right? So they really strain themselves to not have to go use beer. If you can at least use something that has the same, even not flavor, not same taste, but something with the same grape origin, raisin wine, which is clearly not as good as wine, but at least it's in the same ballpark.
It has the same ingredients essentially, but it doesn't have anywhere near the taste or the alcoholic content for sure. Right. For sure. I like the. By the way, they strained themselves was a good one.
Yeah.
So,
I didn't even intend that.
Yeah. So, yeah. It's like you have to think about like the Tosfot and medieval authorities coming from two perspectives. One is the realistic material perspective, but also the Talmudic perspective. You're always safer with wine than you are with beer. So if you want to, like, if some people say beer is okay and some people say it's not okay, well, you can, what in Hebrew would say, you'll say kol hadeot, you satisfy everybody by just drinking wine. There's never an objection to drinking wine. So somebody like, I would say like someone like Rav Hai Gaon, who's in Babylonia, who say you can drink beer, even if wine is widely available, that's a statement in favor of beer. Of course you can drink wine. No one doubts that you can use wine. But to say that you can use beer just because you prefer it is a big statement. I would say that a lot of the Achronim who are in Poland and Russia and in Eastern Europe, the very fact that they regularly, so usually used hard alcohol, turned it into the norm for Kiddush during the day, and perhaps Havdallah as well at night. And that's also another dynamic to think about.
It brings us back to our previous conversation, which the Bach points out is like most people in his country were engaged in some form of commerce with the whiskey. And so whiskey was clearly quite common in his day.
Right. Yeah, just the question is sort of more, if something's common, I mean, and it's also important for our day. In our day, we can all get everything we want all the time, pretty much. I mean, there are some places where you can't, but for the most part, in many places where certainly where Jews live, unless you're traveling in some obscure country, you can get whatever you want, whenever you want it, wherever you want it, which is a very unique situation. I don't know how much wine was available in 18th century, 17th century Eastern Europe. I don't know. I really have no idea how much wine was available. There's a dynamic of like, we start to use something because it's available, and then it just becomes the norm. And even if, I don't know, hundreds of years ago somewhere else it wasn't the norm, well, today in my place, this is the norm, and anyone that deviates from the norm is surprising to me.
Yeah.
And my imagine that's what happens to a certain extent.
By the way, I will point out when we talk about availability, that is something that gets brought up in the medieval ages of what does this mean to be available? And they go back to the Amemar story, which is it something that you can get within a day? Is it the price point, right? Comparing beer versus wine prices, like what is not really available? Because as you mentioned, I mean, they were able to fetch wine for their friend Amemar the next day. So it was around. It wasn't like a day's walk or a day's journey. It was available, but that just wasn't what they weren't used to drinking that.
That's right. And remember, Amemar, he may not be from the same area, but he's not from the land of Israel. He's from Babylonia as well.
Right.
So we do have to be careful, I think. The same way, like to say, is the United States a beer country or a wine country? Well, I think if you went back 75 years, it would be a beer. America would be more beer oriented than wine. Today, I don't know. Today, there's certainly plenty of wine and plenty of wine drinkers in America. When I think of a beer country, I think of England, Germany, maybe Czechoslovakia, Hungary a little bit. And when I think of wine countries, I think of France, Italy, Spain, those areas. There's clear definitions, but there are places, evidently, like Babylonia, which were both. I think, again, that says something that the default back then was wine. That beer was the sort of the newcomer kind of pushing its way in. Can I make that status of wine? Wine never had to fight for its status. Wine is in the Bible. Wine is always, as far as I read a book somewhere that when it comes to the gods are always portrayed. Whether it's Jews or pagans or Christians, the gods are always drinking wine. You don't have, he claimed that there are, like at least in the West, I mean, I don't know about nowhere, but the gods drinking beer. Although there's something in the Gilgamesh, I believe.
Yeah, Gilgamesh, also Ninkasi. Ninkasi was a beer.
Mesopotamian culture.
Well, Mesopotamia is where Babel is. It's Persia. They are a beer land.
That's right.
Even of a beer god.
Right. And Jews have that inheritance both from the earlier stages when they were in Eretz Israel, when they were in the land of Israel, and their culture that's moved, which is also an interesting dynamic. What forms Jewish culture? Is it our heritage, or is it the place where we currently are? And that clearly is a dialogue between our history, our traditions, our books, and just the people that are around us, and the material culture in which we live. So do you want to move on to the more modern period?
Sure. You think we covered every pre-20th century?
They all keep repeating like just the same opinions and just the same debates. Clearly, if you can't get wine, you can drink beer, and then it's just sort of like a discussion. They didn't have. What did they have to drink? They didn't have that much. So I actually this morning when I was out for a run, I started listening to Michael Pollan has a new book, a short book on caffeine. And he talks about the rise of caffeine in Europe, and he makes the point that before the rise of caffeine, workers were just given beer. They were given beer to drink, during the day, basically all anybody drank. They only had water or alcoholic beverages, and alcoholic beverages were slightly safer because of slightly less microbial activity. But then when caffeine came on the scene, all of a sudden you had another beverage you could drink during the day that would, first of all, there is some antibacterial value in caffeine, and people, it was a revolution in human history, because workers who are drinking beer during the day are going to work differently than workers who are drinking caffeine, coffee, during the day. It's going to have a profound effect on your working ability. So he talks. It was interesting that he talks about that. It helps reflect on the paucity of beverages that they had. They didn't have much else. If water wasn't safe, or at least wasn't considered safe, so what else did you have? You used to have beer and wine, and that was about it until, I don't know, 16th century, 15th century, when coffee and tea began to proliferate, and then other beverages, and now I find it's a fascinating world we live in. You can go into any gas station anywhere in America, and the variety of drinks. In Israel, I don't know, I just don't go into gas stations much. They're smaller. I look around and I see so many different things, and it takes me like 10, 15 minutes to pick out the drink that I want, because there's so many of them there. And I usually end up just buying some water, because I know most of them aren't so good. But just think about the variety of beverages in a gas station. Like, these aren't even places like a supermarket, just a million different beverages. It's amazing. I feel, by the way, the same thing when I walk into a pharmacy. Just the amount of different things on the shelves, and the creams and the lotions and the pastes and the medicine and the remedies. We live in a world with such amazing variety, it's almost paralyzing. So then the question becomes, let's talk about Havdallah, right? What does it take to be Chemar Medina today? What does it take to be the wine of the province? Now, does it have to be over alcohol? Can you have a non-alcoholic beverage? So part of the problem is that we all know that people use grape juice. So the second you can use grape juice for Kiddush or Havdallah, you're in essence saying it doesn't have to be alcoholic. It counts as wine if it has the ingredients of wine, even if it hasn't fermented. So it doesn't seem that being that something that you use for Kiddush or Havdallah, certainly at night for Havdallah, has to be alcoholic. So Rav Moshe Feinstein gives a very quick, easy definition, and I want to add to it, but I'll bring his definition. Again, he was the most authoritative rabbi in American Jewish history. He's no longer alive, and he said the importance of a drink is measured when you drink it when you're not thirsty. Right? Water is not an important drink because the only reason to drink water is that you're thirsty. Right? There's no other benefits from water, and our bodies are gauged, right? When we're thirsty, we drink. We want to drink water. When we're not thirsty, we really don't need to drink water. You very rarely see anybody like, I'm really not thirsty, but like, I'll join you for a glass of water. Like, that doesn't happen. So we drink alcohol. I mean, you might drink alcohol. Certainly, sometimes you drink alcohol because you're thirsty, but it's certainly not the only time you drink alcohol. Coffee, right? There are a lot of beverages we drink when we're not thirsty. Now, he thinks Coca-Cola is and soft drink beverages, I don't know how they refer to them everywhere, but Coca-Cola and what I called soda growing up, which meant all sorts of sugary beverages, he thinks those are just to satisfy your thirst. Whether he's correct or not, I don't know. My kids drink them because they love the sugar. I don't buy them for them, but they'll drink them anytime they can get their hands on them. I do not drink any of that stuff. I think that for the most part, he's right. That, like, if you think about somebody who's in an office or at a restaurant and orders a Coke or a Diet Coke or whatever, the reason why they're drinking it is because they need to drink something with their meal. Their meal is going to make them thirsty, and it's not that they're there to drink Coke. They're there to eat the meal, and the Coke is what replaces the water to a certain extent. He thinks you should not be able to do Havdallah over Coca-Cola, for instance, because Coca-Cola is not an important beverage, because the only reason to drink Coca-Cola is you're thirsty. And I think that going along with that, what I would like to say, I like to tell people is that there's a social element to drinking. And the test to me sometimes is, would I say to somebody, would you like to go out for a cup of something or other, and really expect them to drink that? So there's an interesting difference. When I say to somebody, if I say, Rabbi Drew. Let's go out. Let's go grab a cup of coffee sometime. What am I really saying? What do you hear when I say let's go grab a cup of coffee? What do I
There's
want?
gonna be conversation.
Exactly. I want to talk. Actually, I think it's an important social connotation. I want to talk. I don't want to talk for so long that I want to go out for a meal with you. Like when you say I want to go grab a cup of coffee, it means I want to go have a short conversation. And if you come there, if you say to me, Josh, I quit caffeine, I'm not going to drink any caffeine, I'm not insulted. And I don't really care if you order. We go sit down, I don't know, Starbucks, you order. Even if you drink water, I don't care as long as you sit and talk to me for a while. It's perfectly fine. Say to you, I would never say to you, let's go out for a Coke. Like, you'd be like, what? Why are we going out for Coke? You know, you want to come to my kitchen, I'll pour you a glass of Coke. I don't know. No, I haven't heard anyone say, maybe in the 50s they said that. Let's go out for a soft drink. But today, no one goes out for a Coke. But when I say to you, let's go out for a beer, if you were to respond to me, I'm a recovering alcoholic, I don't drink, I wouldn't say to you, oh, don't worry about it, you can just order some water there, right? That would not be nice, right? When I say let's go out for a beer, I'm sort of hoping that you actually want to drink a beer. I wouldn't say let's go out to a beer to somebody who I know doesn't drink beer. Beer, yes, I drink beer on my own, but it is very common to say, "I'll come over to your house. We'll grab a beer. We'll sit in the backyard." Nowadays, we can't sit inside, but we can. At least in Israel, we can sit outside and we can drink beer in the backyard. And there's an expectation that you like beer, and that means that there's a social element to it. The reason why I want to drink beer with you is both to drink the beer and because I want to spend time with you. And I think that's an important element. I wonder about tea. People sometimes ask me about tea. Of course, we drink. If I say to somebody, let's go out for tea, maybe in America and Israel, we don't do that much, but maybe in England, if you invite somebody, if the Queen invites you for tea, which would be great. I would love the Queen to invite me for tea. I think I have to drink the tea, right? I don't think I can say, like, I don't like tea. Can you get me a cup of coffee, for instance? Or I prefer a beer. Would not be cool. So I think that that's an important test. There's a social aspect that our social lives are organized around the alcohol, which is one of the things I love. I really, quite frankly, love about alcohol is not just the effect on me, but the way it brings people together. I sorely miss. Usually at this time of year, I'm on my way to the States. I spend the summer in the States. And when I'm there, when I'm not working, I'll visit breweries. And I gotta say, it's very sad that it's not going to happen this summer. I hope it'll happen next summer. But there's a wonderful vibe at places like these breweries where people from all different walks of life. Here I am, a Talmudist from Israel, sitting down with an electrician from central Massachusetts. We sit at a table, we start talking about our lives. It happens to me all the time. And it's a great way to meet people over the love of a shared drink. I think historically, it's been played an important role in human society in that way. Interesting questions like what other beverages? Like, what about a milkshake? Like adults don't invite themselves out for milkshakes. Like it's kind of like a kiddie drink.
Yeah.
But it would be acceptable to go. Like, could you do? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine doing a Havdallah over a milkshake. I don't know how I would make it. Chocolate milk. Yeah, I wouldn't do. I would really, in a pinch, there's been a couple times I've done Havdallah over orange juice. It's usually just because there's nothing else available, and I don't know. I know that there are people who say you can, but I don't like to do it. I always run as soon as Shabbat is over, so I have a little bit of a problem with the beer. Because if I drink a beer and then go out for a run, it's not such a great idea. So
it's fuel. It's fuel for the run.
Afterwards, it's really good.
Hey there, before we finish up the episode, I wanted to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Chaim Litvin, who does kosher supervision on distilleries in the state of Kentucky.
The Wall Street Journal actually did an article about me in 2017.
Oh, really?
Front page, Wall Street Journal, and kind of nicknamed me the Bourbon Rabbi, and it kind of just snowballed from there.
They nicknamed you that. That
Yeah.
wasn't something you took upon yourself. They got all right. All right, Dr. Kulp, this was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to be here. I love talking to you. I love talking about alcohol. I love talking about beer. I love talking about Talmud. You hit all the great things I love talking about. So thanks. It's been great.
Absolutely. And L'chaim.
L'chaim, l'chaim. To happy drinking and health and happiness.
Amen.